There is a moment right before you decide to change your life when everything becomes strangely quiet inside you, a kind of inner pause, a soft suspension between who you were yesterday and who you are daring to become now. This introduction begins in that pause, not in noise, not in effort, in the silent place where your inner assumptions are born. Because the truth is simple. Every transformation you have been trying to force, chase, beg for, or manifest starts here, inside a space no one can see, but everyone can feel. And today, I want you to feel it fully, not intellectually, not as an idea, but as a breath moving through your chest, as the shift happening in your belly, as the subtle, sacred truth your mind has been resisting and your soul has been whispering for years. Your assumptions are the only reality that matters. Maybe you've been living with a quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from checking your bank account with a mix of hope and fear, from waiting for someone to text you back so you can finally feel secure, from measuring your value by reactions, numbers, or external signals. Maybe you've been trying to stay positive while secretly scanning the physical world for signs that your affirmation is working. And every time reality shows the same old patterns, a part of you tightens, collapses a little and says, "See, nothing is changing. I see that struggle. It's real. And it doesn't mean you're failing. It means you've been taught to look for evidence in the wrong place. You've been taught to believe that the world moves first and that you respond after." But Neville was clear. What you see is the echo, not the cause. The outer world is late, delayed, old. It has no creative power. It can only show you the assumptions you once accepted, often unconsciously. The pain is not that your life isn't changing. The pain is that you've been waiting for the world to validate a transformation that hasn't yet stabilized inside you. It's like planting a seed and digging it up every few hours to check if it's growing. Your heart wants change, but your reflex is to look outward to measure if you're allowed to believe in it. And that reflex is the real block, not the lack of opportunity, not the lack of luck, not the lack of proof, the lack of inner permission. Bruce Lipton has shown that perception is the signal that tells your biology how to behave, and perception itself is shaped by assumption. Neville said the world is a shadow. Lipton said perception rewires the body. Do you see the convergence? What you assume becomes the instruction your entire system obeys. What you assume becomes the world you meet. So let me speak to you with the gentleness you deserve. You are not fighting circumstances. You are not fighting people. You are not fighting your past. You are fighting only one thing, the ancient habit of believing that reality is stronger than your inner state. And it's not. It never was. You don't need to crush the world. You need to stop letting the world crush your focus. You are not here to wrestle with appearances. You are here to reclaim the quiet authority of your inner conviction. Once you choose the assumption you want to live from, and once you occupy it fully, sensorially, emotionally, the world becomes obligated to rearrange itself around you. Not instantly, not theatrically, but inevitably. The same way a river shifts around a new rock, reality shifts around a new identity. As this journey begins, breathe a little deeper. Let your shoulders fall from your ears. Let your awareness sink into the place just behind your chest. You don't need to force anything. Just listen, because everything you've been chasing starts in the inner space where your assumptions take shape. This introduction is not information, it is an initiation, a subtle repositioning of your power back where it belongs, inside you. Now, the world waits. Now the old patterns lose authority. Now you begin to see that what you assume in the quiet moments determines everything you eventually touch, receive, and become. And from this moment forward, we walk with one truth burning at the center. The world moves after you move internally. Never before. There comes a moment when you begin to notice how much of your life has been lived in reaction mode. You wake up and immediately look outside yourself. Messages, bills, notifications, people's moods, numbers, circumstances. Without realizing it, you let the world tell you who you are before you've even remembered your own inner name. And in that silent, automatic habit, a hidden blockade appears. The compulsion to seek confirmation outside, the invisible need to verify your worth, your progress, your success through the eyes of a world that only reflects your past assumptions. This is the war beneath the surface, a war not of violence but of focus, A war between the version of you that knows its power and the version of you that still believes circumstances hold authority. Every time you look outward for proof, your identity contracts. Every time you turn inward for truth, your identity expands. This chapter is about noticing that contraction and reclaiming that expansion. Neville said, "Dare to assume and persist, despite failure or seeming denial." He didn't say this as a poetic idea. He said it as someone who understood the architecture of consciousness. He saw that most people abandon their assumption at the first sign of contradiction, collapsing their inner reality in the face of outer noise. But what you call denial is only the world reflecting its outdated script. It is not a message. It is not a warning. It is not a sign that you're wrong. It is simply the fading echo of an old inner state. When you understand this, contradiction becomes harmless. It becomes a shadow passing on the wall, not an obstacle blocking the door. Persistence is not effort. Persistence is quiet loyalty to your chosen identity. It is your willingness to remain inwardly aligned even when the physical scene has not yet updated. There is a moment in every transformation when you must realize something radical. You don't need evidence. Evidence needs you. Evidence follows assumption the way a shadow follows light. It cannot lead. It cannot initiate. It cannot define. It can only respond. And yet, for most of your life, you've been taught to reverse this order, to wait for the world to show you something different before you allow yourself to feel different. This reversal is the root of all delay. The feeling of being stuck is not a lack of progress. It is the habit of letting the outer echo dictate your inner state. Once you stop expecting the echo to change first, movement begins. The world is not resisting you. The world is waiting for an instruction you haven't stabilized. To help your mind experience this truth instead of just hearing it, shift your attention deliberately from circumstance to inner narrative several times a day, not as a performance, not as pressure, but as a gentle return. You notice the fear rising, and instead of feeding it, you soften your breath. You notice the old story returning, and instead of arguing with it, you allow the new one to take its place. This is not denial. This is discipline of perception. Every time you turn inward, you choose the cause instead of the effect. You become the author instead of the character reacting to the plot. With time, the shift becomes automatic. You begin to live from the state you once only imagined. Think of a movie screen. No matter how vivid the image is on the screen has no creative power. It cannot change itself. It cannot choose a new scene. It cannot rewrite the story it displays. The power belongs to the projector hidden behind you. The world is that screen. Your assumption is the projector. And the moment you understand this metaphor not as a concept, but as a lived truth, something opens inside you. A realization that the fight you've been having with circumstances has always been a misunderstanding. The image on the screen may be loud, dramatic, overwhelming, but it is still just an image. The real shift happens where no one can see it, where only you stand, where the light source shines, where assumption becomes destiny. When you live from this awareness, the invisible war ends, not because the world becomes easier, but because you stop expecting it to lead. You recognize that the power has always been closer than your breath. You reclaim your right to decide who you are before the world decides what it shows you. And your new identity begins to radiate through every thought, every feeling, every choice, until the outer echo has no choice but to follow. There is a quiet moment in every seeker's life when they begin to realize that the world they see is not the world they live in. The eyes record images, but the mind interprets meanings. And most of those meanings were inherited long before you had the chance to question them. You wake up, and the first thing you register is the physical world, the room, the numbers, the unfinished tasks, the familiar patterns. Without noticing it, you let your senses define your identity for the day. Your mood becomes a reaction. Your belief becomes conditional. Your desire becomes a negotiation. And before you take your second breath, the five senses have already claimed the throne that belongs to your inner state. This is the tyranny of appearances. Not because the world is cruel, but because it is loud. Loud enough to drown the subtle truth inside you if you don't return to yourself with intention. People unconsciously worship the senses. They give external reality an authority it simply does not have. The senses were never meant to lead. They were meant to follow. They reflect the physical expression of what once lived inside you. They show you the past in motion, not the present in creation. But when you believe what you see is the whole truth, you begin to shrink. If the bank account is low, you feel unworthy. If the message never arrives, you feel forgotten. If the opportunity hasn't shown up yet, you feel blocked. The senses speak with urgency, but their message is incomplete. And in that incompleteness, fear grows. Not because anything is truly wrong, but because you are interpreting the echo as the origin. Modern cognitive science tells us that sensory perception is not a mirror of reality. It is a story your brain constructs. Your eyes do not tell you what exists. They tell you what your mind already expects to see. Your senses confirm your assumptions. They do not contradict them. This means something profound. What you call reality is not the objective world. It is the inner state you have accepted, dressed in physical form. When you understand this, the world stops feeling solid. It becomes fluid, responsive, permeable. It becomes a language rather than a law. And you begin to see how every limitation you thought was external was actually an internal expectation being reflected back at you. In moments of doubt, pause and let the senses lose their throne. When fear rises, notice it without merging with it. When an external trigger appears, an email, a silence, an unexpected bill, feel the instinct to fall into old meaning, and instead, let a breath widen your awareness. A single breath can break the trance of appearances. This is not about pretending, it is about remembering. Remembering that your emotions, your interpretations, your identity are not dictated by the world. The world responds to them. Every time you bring awareness to this, you loosen the grip of the old state. You begin to trust what you feel internally more than what you see externally. And that shift, subtle as it seems, restructures your entire timeline. Imagine someone mistaking a shadow for the person who cast it. They scream at the shadow. They try to reason with it. They interpret it as threat or rejection. They forget it is only an outline shaped by something behind it. The physical world is that shadow. It moves. It shifts. It stretches. But it has no power of its own. The real substance is you, your state, your assumption, your self-concept. When you understand this deeply, you stop arguing with the shadow. You stop fearing the shadow. You stop chasing the shadow. Instead, you turn toward the source, the inner light that creates the form. And in that moment, something changes. The world no longer feels like an opponent or a test. It becomes an echo, a reflection, a canvas. Your senses lose their tyranny, not because they weaken, but because you rise above them. You begin to feel, perhaps for the first time in years, that you are not trapped by what you see. You are not limited by what appears. You are the one choosing the assumption that shapes the shadow. And with that realization, the power you once thought the world had over you returns quietly, steadily, into your own hands. When the world feels louder than your inner truth, pause with me. If this message is waking something real inside you, subscribe and stay connected to the place where your assumptions regain their power. There is a quiet exhaustion that settles in when you keep trying to change your life, but end up meeting the same situations again and again, the same tensions with money, the same insecurities in relationships, the same hesitations when opportunities appear. It feels as if something invisible is pulling you back to an old version of yourself, no matter how many new desires you set. And the truth is, that feeling is not imagined. There is a pull, a subtle gravity that keeps recreating familiar outcomes, not because you are failing and not because life is against you, but because your inner identity remains unchanged while your goals keep evolving. You are trying to walk into a new future while carrying the emotional posture of your past. And that past, if left unexamined, becomes a loop that repeats itself with silent precision. Self-schema theory explains something Neville taught long before psychology had the language for it. You don't behave according to what you want. You behave according to who you believe you are. You may desire abundance, but if your identity is still shaped by scarcity, your actions, reactions, and interpretations will unconsciously support that old state. You may desire love, but if your identity is still shaped by abandonment, you will filter interactions through that expectation. You may desire success, but if your identity is still shaped by self-doubt, you will sabotage the very openings that were meant for you. The self-schema, the internal model of me, is the command center behind every decision, and until it changes, the world cannot. There is a moment in your journey when you must face a difficult but liberating truth. The future you want cannot reach you because your identity is blocking the door. It is not punishment. It is not destiny. It is alignment. The world is matching your inner posture, not your wishes, not your affirmations, not your hopes. Your posture. The way you see yourself when no one is watching. The tone with which you speak to yourself in silence. The assumptions you carry when you wake up and when you go to sleep. That internal definition becomes the law that shapes your outer experience. When the identity upgrades, everything else follows. When it remains the same, nothing else can. So begin with something simple, something small, something that your nervous system can accept. Choose one trait your future self embodies and let it ripple into your day in a subtle, grounded action. If your future self is financially confident, carry yourself with the posture of someone who trusts their path. If your future self is emotionally secure, respond as someone who no longer fears loss. If your future self is successful, make decisions that reflect inner clarity rather than hesitation. These small behaviors are not about performance. They are about training your body to recognize a new identity. They signal to your subconscious that a shift has begun. And the subconscious, once convinced, restructures everything else. Imagine driving with an outdated GPS. No matter how many times you choose a new destination, the system keeps redirecting you back to the old route. It is not malice. It is programming. Your identity works the same way. You may change the dream, but if the identity remains old, the path keeps repeating. Once you update the GPS settings, the entire route transforms. The same landscapes look different. The same choices lead somewhere new. The same life becomes a different reality because the navigator inside you has been rewritten. This is the magnetic pull of identity. It shapes your emotional reactions, your decisions, your expectations, your habits, and your beliefs about what is possible. When you shift it intentionally, the loops that once felt eternal begin to dissolve, and what once felt like destiny reveals itself simply as a pattern, one that you have the power to rewrite from within. There is a quiet turning point in your inner journey when you finally see that not every circumstance deserves your emotional involvement. For years, you may have fed old patterns without realizing it. Each moment of fear, each surge of frustration, each attempt to fix what was happening outside of you became nourishment for the very reality you wanted to leave behind. The old state stayed alive, not because it was powerful, but because your attention kept it breathing. When you recognize this, something inside you softens. You begin to understand that the collapse of an old identity requires less effort than you imagined. It requires less action, not more. What dissolves a reality is not force, it is absence of fuel. Neville's guidance to ignore the evidence of the senses points to this inner withdrawal. Not withdrawal from life, but withdrawal from reactive interpretation. When a familiar circumstance rises, an unexpected bill, a delay, a silence, it is not a message that you're failing. It is simply the last echo of who you once believed yourself to be. Treat it like a fading imprint. Let it pass through your awareness without letting it define you. The moment you stop reacting from your old identity, the old identity loses structure. This shift begins in small spaces, a breath before you respond, a softening of your shoulders when the old story tries to return, a quiet decision to remain aligned with the self you are becoming. These subtle pauses break the automatic cycle that once fed the past. They signal to your inner world that you are no longer available for the patterns you once sustained. Picture a fire burning. It does not go out because you confront the flames. It goes out because you stop feeding it. The same is true for the unwanted realities in your life. They collapse when you reclaim your attention, when you stop reinforcing a state that no longer reflects who you choose to be. There comes a moment when you notice how often you've approached your own desires as if you were asking for permission. You wait for signs, for approval, for circumstances to shift before you allow yourself to feel worthy of what you want. This creates a subtle posture of petitioning, as though reality must validate your desire before it becomes real. But inward creation does not work this way. Life responds to the identity you occupy, not the one you hope to earn. When you stand in doubt, the world mirrors hesitation. When you stand in inner certainty, the world adjusts to reflect it. This is the quiet authority Neville spoke of, the understanding that your assumption is the only law shaping your path. The moment you embody a new inner certainty, people and situations respond differently. Psychology calls this the halo effect, but spiritually, it is the natural consequence of inner alignment. You begin to notice that the world meets you at the level of your self-concept. Confidence in this sense is not a feeling that arrives on its own. It is a decision you choose again and again until your nervous system recognizes it as truth. It becomes less about appearing confident and more about remembering that your inner state dictates the energy you carry, the choices you make, and the outcomes that unfold. To step into this quiet authority, you start by inhabiting the identity that already holds what you desire, not as performance and not as fantasy, but as an internal tone, a way of breathing, a way of speaking to yourself, a line of inner dialogue that affirms the reality you have claimed. When this becomes stable within you, the outer world rearranges itself with surprising clarity. Picture a king placing a crown on his head. He doesn't question whether the crown is real. He doesn't wait for the kingdom's approval. His authority is not negotiated. It is assumed. And because it is assumed, everything around him responds. This is the essence of your inner power. When you accept the identity that aligns with your desire, the world follows the instruction written in your state. There is a quiet truth you begin to recognize once you observe yourself with sincerity. Most of your emotional reactions are echoes of an older identity, not reflections of what is actually happening now. A message left unanswered can trigger a familiar fear. A financial inconvenience can awaken an old sense of inadequacy. A delay can reopen the story that you are forgotten or unsupported. These reactions feel immediate, but they are memories wearing the mask of the present. When you respond from them, you reinforce the very version of yourself you are trying to outgrow. Emotional reactivity is not a flaw. It is simply a signal that you are still referencing an outdated inner atmosphere. Neuroscience shows that emotional states filter perception. When cortisol rises, your mind narrows, scanning for danger instead of possibility. You begin to interpret neutral events as threats. The world appears smaller, harsher, more rigid. But this is not the world changing. It is your internal climate tightening. And when your inner climate contracts, you lose access to the identity you are consciously trying to embody. This is why Neville insisted that feeling is the true creative power. It is the atmosphere through which every assumption is expressed. Without emotional governance, your desires float above you, disconnected from the state that could bring them into form. The shift begins the moment you choose to interrupt the emotional spiral instead of merging with it. A slow breath, a quiet pause, a gentle reframing of the moment. These small interventions reset the limbic system and open a doorway back to your conscious identity. You are not avoiding emotion. You are reshaping the environment from which emotion arises. Over time, this becomes an act of sovereignty. You notice the old state rising, and you allow it to pass without letting it define your next step. The more you practice this inner redirection, the easier it becomes to remain anchored in the self you are becoming rather than the self you are leaving behind. Imagine the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. A thermometer merely reacts to the temperature around it. A thermostat sets the temperature and holds it until the environment adjusts. You are meant to live as the thermostat, the one who establishes the emotional climate from which life unfolds. And when you hold that climate steadily, calmly, quietly, the outer world begins to reorganize in ways that reflect the atmosphere you have chosen within. There comes a moment in your awakening when you begin to notice how often you defend the very patterns that hurt you, not out of weakness, but out of familiarity. The mind prefers the known, even if the known is painful. You explain your fears as facts. You justify your doubts with memories. You repeat stories that once protected you, but now restrict you. This internal debate becomes a quiet courtroom where you present evidence for why things cannot change. And every time you argue for your limitations, you breathe life back into an identity you are trying to release. The conflict is subtle but powerful. The desire for expansion meets the mind's need for consistency. Cognitive dissonance shows that the brain resists anything that contradicts its established self-image. If you have carried beliefs of unworthiness, scarcity, or abandonment for years, the mind will try to maintain them, even when your heart longs for something more. This resistance does not mean you are incapable of change. It means change has begun. The old identity is trying to hold its ground. But the moment you recognize this inner tension, you unlock a deeper understanding. Your excuses are not explanations, they are manifestations in disguise. They are the echoes of an outdated self attempting to remain relevant. This is where a subtle, powerful shift takes place. When you acknowledge the belief that holds you back and gently reshape it, you interrupt the cycle. You begin to see the difference between the story you inherited and the truth you are ready to claim. This is not about forcing positivity. It is about choosing a narrative that reflects your new self rather than your old wounds. As you question the beliefs that once felt unquestionable, your inner world begins to expand, and that expansion naturally creates new possibilities, new reactions, new outcomes. Picture yourself standing in a courtroom where you are both the witness and the judge. For years, you prosecuted your own future, listing every reason things might fail. But now, as you step into your new identity, you notice how unnecessary those arguments have become. The evidence you once clung to no longer defines you. You are not the limitations you once defended. You are the consciousness that outgrows them. And when you stop arguing for your past, your future finally has room to breathe. There is a subtle moment in your awakening when you begin to realize how much of your identity has been shaped by the reactions of others. A single tone, a delayed response, a shift in someone's expression, these tiny signals can change the way you feel about yourself, as if your worth was something fragile that needed constant protection. This quiet dependency drains your power. Each time you look outward for reassurance, you abandon the inner stability that manifestation requires. The need for approval rarely comes from the present moment. It comes from old emotional imprints, patterns formed from fear of being dismissed, ignored, or forgotten. These memories create a version of you that tries to earn acceptance rather than inhabit truth. And yet, you cannot hold a powerful assumption while negotiating your value through someone else's perception. The identity that manifests and the identity that seeks permission are not the same. When you stop seeking validation, a new clarity emerges. You begin to feel the weight of your own presence, the quiet authority that comes from trusting your inner world more than external reactions. The shift is subtle but profound. Instead of adjusting yourself to be chosen, you align yourself with the self you have chosen to become. Imagine driving while waiting for applause at every intersection. The journey stalls. But when you release the need for approval, the path ahead becomes yours again, steady, direct, and aligned with the identity that creates your reality. There comes a moment when desire must stop living in the future. Wanting keeps you reaching. Assuming lets you arrive. The Galatea effect shows that your self-expectation becomes the quiet blueprint reality follows. When you shift from hoping to embodying, your inner world settles into a new alignment. A simple gesture, a breath, a posture, an inner yes, can anchor this identity more deeply than hours of wishing. It signals to your subconscious that the change has already occurred. Crossing this threshold is subtle, yet decisive. You stop seeking the future and begin living from the self who already holds it. There is a moment when you notice how much your energy scatters toward doubts, old emotions, and external noise. These distractions don't weaken you. They simply remind you of the identity you once lived in. Neuroplasticity shows that whatever you repeatedly focus on becomes the dominant pattern in your mind. This means focus is not force. It is alignment. When you consistently return to the inner state you've chosen, your mind begins to treat it as the only truth worth responding to. Just as tuning a radio filters out every other signal, your deliberate attention makes anything that contradicts your assumption fade into silence. Every change you seek begins within you. Neville taught that the outer world is only a reflection, and Greg Braden showed that perception reshapes biology itself. When you assume a new identity with sincerity, reality quietly reorganizes to match it. The world is soft clay, molded by your inner state. Stop wrestling shadows. Shape the source. Let your inner state lead your life. Subscribe and align with the reality that already awaits you.